007N7 is the worst survivor in Forsaken, in my opinion. Now, I know 007 has a lot of shooters and people who like to defend him from being the worst, but hopefully today I can express my thoughts and opinions, which are all just my own personal opinions, to explain why I personally think he is the worst survivor in the game. Now, let me reiterate again for the third time. This is just my opinion, and you're completely allowed to disagree with it, and I encourage you to actually play him before casting judgment yourself, as this is just some random dude's opinion on the internet. Now, let's move on to 007's kit before I actually talk about him. If you don't know who 007 is, then let me explain his abilities real fast for you. 007 has 3 main abilities and 1 passive ability. I'll talk about his passive first and then chain it into his other abilities because the passive is actually kind of important for his whole kit. I was going to explain his abilities out of order, but I just decided to keep them in order and go back to them when needed. 007's only passive is called Dex, and Dex allows 007 to see the furthest survivor spawn point from him. This is important for every single one of your other abilities, so please keep this in mind. His first main ability is called Clone. 007 summons a clone that can run around for 10 seconds before it dies. Upon summoning his clone, 007 himself turns invisible and undetectable for 4 seconds. Your clone's aura is white and you can see where it's going at all times, and if the killer attacks it, you get a notification. However, when summoning your clone, do not touch it because the clone will die. 007's second ability is called Cool GUI. Remember your passive Dex that I mentioned earlier? This ability will teleport you to the indicated spawn point on your screen from your Dex passive after 6 seconds, and you get slowed down by 85% while using it. Any damage you take, however, will cancel this ability, and you can also hop on a generator to cancel it as well. And finally, we have his last ability, Inject. Inject applies one of 3 functions of your choosing into your clone. These 3 functions are as follows: Aimless, Pathfinder, and Cursor. By default, the clone is set on aimless pathing, meaning that the clone will just kind of do whatever it wants when you activate it. It can stand still, run in circles, or collide with the wall 2 feet in front of it. Your second function is called Pathfinder. Remember your Dex passive again? When using Pathfind clones, they will run to whatever the indicated spawn point of your Dex passive is. Now, the third and final function is Cursor. The clone will move to wherever position the cursor is on your screen. On console, you need to click Select and move the cursor, use the white dot in the middle of your screen, or Shift Lock in order to use this properly. But this is probably the most convincing of the 3 functions. Now, those abilities sound pretty cool, right? Well, I won't deny that tricking players with the clones while you scamper away and use Cool GUI is fun sometimes, but it's only when it actually works. But most of the time, it's never going to be that easy. Now, let me talk about 007 himself and some of the problems I have with him. 007 is a stealth character, meaning his playstyle is more revolved around tricking the killer and getting away from the action. However, he's sometimes not very good at the stealth part, aka his whole design, and a lot of people who play him tend to use his abilities super incorrectly or in super weird ways, and it usually ends up getting them killed. But let's also not forget he has super janky clone AI that can sometimes rat your clone out completely. Anyways, let's go through his abilities in order, and I'll describe some of the big issues that I personally have and that I see people make with these abilities. One of the biggest problems I see of 007 players that, unless you've played a lot of him, is some players seem to think that they are completely invisible after using his clone, which is just not true. 007 is almost completely invisible, but you can still see him super easily if you look around the area or just wait for the 4 seconds of invisibility and undetectable to end. Every killer, except Cool Kid, has some way to see survivor auras, meaning that if they're aware that 007 is in the area and has used his clone, then if they just wait the 4 seconds, they'll be able to find him. 007 is the biggest counter to Cool Kid, but that's kinda it. Cool Kid struggles the most to deal with 007 when he's not just directly chasing him because he has to rely on his minions to actually find 007, but 007 can just clone and deal with them pretty easily. When it comes to any other killer, however, 007 is significantly weaker and can be dealt with a whole lot easier. A lot of 007 players I've seen never take the chance to actually run with their invisibility and instead would rather just watch their clone run around, which, unless you're using cursor mode, is a really bad idea, as if the killer finds out it's just a clone, which is pretty easy most of the time because of how jank they can be with their really bad AI, they can then usually go towards where the clone spawned, and if you're just sitting there observing it, then you more than likely get caught. A lot of players like to bring up a certain tech that you can do with the cursor clone called clone parrying, and my response to that is as follows. I present to you the Humble Slasher, a character whose attacks pierce and hit multiple targets, and he also has Behead, which renders you helpless when hit by it and renders you unable to use a clone. Now, Slasher's obviously not the only killer capable of dealing with this. 1X can use Entangle and inflict helpless as well, as keep 007 in place if he's hit by it, but anyways, I'm getting a bit off topic. A lot of 007 mains will try to sell the idea that clone parrying works 100% of the time, all the time, which it doesn't. The clone parry can be a lot harder to pull off than 007 mains tend to let on, and more thinking tends to go into it as well. For example, distance and timing are the biggest factors on deciding when to clone parry, as sometimes if a killer is smart and assumes you're going to clone parry, they can easily just not swing or just walk past it, and they can also just wait to see if you'll even try to use it, and then you're still dead. Another factor to remember is you have higher hit priority over your clones, meaning unless the next attack from the killer would kill you, you'll still get hit through the clone. Plus, a lot of players are super obvious when they're trying to clone parry, as they'll just look right at you when you get super close, and if you just wait a few seconds before swinging, you can possibly call their bluff and respond in kind if they don't clone, or if they do, just follow them around. I'm sure they won't mind your looming presence while they're on a stroll. Now, I'm not saying clone parrying can't be effective at all. It's more effective on killers that have a longer attack wind-up animation, as it leaves more of a window for you to predict when to clone parry. But killers like Slasher and Cool Kid have super quick attack animations, meaning that against them, it'll be a lot harder to pull off, and it's usually just not worth the risk that comes with it. Maybe that's why I never see 007 players do it in my lobbies, because I pretty much only play Slasher. But anyways, let's switch off clone for a little bit, but we'll come back to it later, and let's talk about Cool GUI. Cool GUI is a great tool for getting yourself away from the killer, however, it can also put you in a worse position than you were already in. I've seen some people use their Cool GUI as soon as the round starts and then get murdered a few seconds later because they spawn right in front of the killer, and who wouldn't want to take a free kill at the start of the round? Plus, if the killer sees your aura while you're using it, if they know of the survivor spawn points, which most experienced killers do, they can greet you the second you appear with a nice crisp swing to the head. Plus, the slowdown from Cool GUI upon activation can really screw you over sometimes if the killer spots you, either by pure accident with an aura read, or if a teammate leads the killer to you. You're locked into the teleport, meaning that if the killer hits you with a heavy attack like Gashing Wound, you've just lost half your health. This ability is probably his most useful one in his kit in my opinion, but at the same time, it's also the most predictable for experienced killers, even more so than the clone itself. Depending on the map and depending on your current position, if the killer has knowledge of the spawn points as mentioned earlier and witnesses you starting to teleport, they can easily just meet you or be close to you by the time you teleport yourself. The only way to cancel a teleport is by getting on a generator or taking damage, and because of the slowdown when using this ability, if you're not hugging the generator or the environmental hazard to cause you to take damage and stop the teleport, then beam me up, Scotty, because you're getting teleported. Another issue is if your teammates actually completed all the generators like good teammates should, and if you're on a map with no hazards, then once you lock in the teleport, you better hope the killer doesn't know spawns or didn't see you leave, because if they did, then guess what? You're also screwed. Cool GUI is, like I said, probably the most useful thing in his kit, but it also has so many drawbacks that it's just as bad as his clone ability, and it's so map dependent that sometimes the spawn points are just so close to each other, or they're just barely a skip and a jump away, that even if the killer guesses the wrong spawn, they can easily just go to the other spawn closest to the other one, and you're just gonna get jumped either way. It is nice being able to teleport across the map, but you also have to know when to actually use it, and that's probably the biggest thing with Cool GUI, and you better hope that the killer doesn't know how to counter it either. Now, let's switch gears and move back to clone. This time, also talking about inject a little bit. Out of your 3 functions on inject, only 2 of them are actually really useful in my opinion, and that's cursor and pathfinder. Aimless is quite literally useless, and most of the time it'll just faceplant a wall or a rock or any obstacle on the map and just kind of stand there, and it's also the most unconvincing of the functions anyways. Cursor is really useful, but it's slightly more difficult to use on console, as you have to press select on Xbox to bring your cursor up in the first place, and to even get it in position might take a few valuable seconds you could have been using the clone for. You can also use the white dot in the middle of your screen, but that's sort of jank as well, and if you barely touch the object you're behind with it, the clone will run back towards you. And you can shift lock as well, but that's still not the best either. I'm not quite sure about mobile, as I don't play mobile, but cursor can be kind of jank, especially if the wall you're hiding behind is too tall, but you also can't hide behind a wall that's too low, or when you become uninvisible and lose your undetectable, the killer will just see you. Pathfinder is nice and all, but it's also kind of unbelievable sometimes, as it just runs exactly to where the spawn point listed on your screen is, and it doesn't stop running ever unless it hits an obstacle. Then it'll just sort of slide along it until it can get itself unstuck, and sometimes it doesn't even make it to the spawn point. So realistically, the only realistic looking clones are the cursor clones, but even then, depending on map clutter and obstacles, they can be super difficult to control. Plus, a lot of 007 players mention using the clone to body block attacks for other survivors, but me personally, I have yet to see a 007 main even do this, but I also hardly ever see 007 mains, let alone players in my lobbies, and it just kind of makes me wonder a little bit with how many people that claim to play this character. But anyways, plus this is just a me thing, but like I said earlier, I really only play Slasher, and as mentioned earlier, Slasher's attacks pierce, so a clone block is not going to do anything to help the person I'm chasing, other than make me think, wow, if this is a real player, they're just helping me. Or if it's a clone, I think, wow, they must not remember that Slasher pierces. The clone block can help on the other killers in the game, but even then, it's not a strategy I see 007 players do literally ever. And if you're a 007 player who does this strategy, I'd like to see you in my lobby and see you do it, because for how many 007 players claim they do it, I honestly never see it. And I'd like to see someone actually be able to pull it off pretty well and successfully. Plus, 007's clone AI is super weird sometimes. Noli's clones used to be really awful looking, but they were updated to look realistic and play how an actual player would. So why can't 007 also get an update to his AI for his clones? That would make him a significantly better character already, and I would honestly maybe even move him up off the worst survivor in the game podium if he had that update. But until that happens, and if it ever does, he's going to stay at the bottom. 007 also relies way too heavily on a killer's personal skill level, as he seems extremely strong and busted against newer players, but more experienced killers will wipe the floor with a 007 if they find him. 007 is easily countered if you have eyes, and he's really easy to see when you're close, even when invisible, and there's nothing he can really do about it. Plus, experienced killers usually take note of the direction the clone came from and will just walk over there to find the sender and return the kindness with a nice lovely primary attack. Now, to give 007 some credit, if left alive until last man standing, he can be a true monster for even experienced players. However, an experienced player is also never going to let you get even remotely close to last man standing as a 007, because they are fully aware of your last man standing power, and that's really the only power you have as 007. And most times you can't even use it, because the killer will usually drop everything and chase you down before last man standing, so you better be good at hiding and looping, because if they find you, they're going to make your life a nightmare. Plus, if you're ever unsure as killer if the 007 you're chasing is actually real or if it's a clone, just hit it. Just watch the 007 player's icon in the bottom left corner, and if their health goes down after you hit it, then they're the real deal. And if it doesn't go down, then it's a fake. So do a 180 and make sure to go back to where the clone came from, and you might end up finding the 007 sitting there. Now, the final talking point for this section before I move over to how I would probably change 007 to make him better is going to be about something that he himself can't really control, but suffers probably the most of any survivor in the current roster we have, and that is his map dependability. 007 is way too reliant on maps in Forsaken, as not having a map with lots of clutter in the game, if there's too little clutter, it's hard to make a getaway if you manage to trick the killer, and they can usually find you again super quick. But if there's too much clutter, then depending on your positioning, or if there's a really high spot on the map, it can be really difficult to control your clones on cursor mode, or on Pathfinder it might run into things more often. Also, some maps are smaller than others in the game, meaning that with cool GUI, if you try to teleport sometimes, the distance between the spawn points is so minimal that if the killer sees it, then they can go to the spawn point you might teleport to, and if they guess wrong, they can just walk over to the other super close spawn point. Plus, some 007 players I've seen on socials have talked about certain skins that can make him harder to see depending on the map. Did you catch what was wrong with that sentence? If not, it's depending on the map. You shouldn't have to run a skin for a stealth character that makes them harder to see depending on the map. They shouldn't need a skin to help them be stealthier, and they shouldn't have the maps working against them in general, because in Forsaken you also have no clue what the map you're going to even be playing on is, meaning how can you decide what skin to run if you don't even know what map you're going to get anyways? You could end up picking the completely wrong skin for him and just end up making yourself even more visible on a certain map. And I'll say it again, and I'll say it as many times as I have to, a stealth character should not have to rely on a certain skin or a certain map that they can't even control just to help them get away better. That's not how a stealth character should play at all, and it's not fair to the stealth character themselves. Plus, I also think maps should have a certain uniform amount of clutter between all of them. That way, characters like 007 and either other characters characters in the roster don't have to suffer playing on certain maps compared to others. Plus, I just think having to run a skin on a stealth character that makes them even darker, or depending on the map makes them blend in, is just goofy anyways. And that really shouldn't be a function that you have to use just to hopefully increase your survivability just by the slightest percent. Anyways, I think I've pretty much gone over all the general points I had wrote down, so let's move over to the closing thoughts section, and I'll give a few personal opinions on how I would probably change 007 to make him more viable. Overall, I personally think that 007 is the worst survivor in Forsaken, and it's not even close for me. I know people like to clown on Guest, me myself included, and some people like to clown on Chance, which is really weird, but they can be useful and have way more helpfulness during a match than 007 would ever dream of. But I know that 007 has a lot of people who love him, and that's completely fine. However, he realistically relies way too much on factors outside of his own control and a lackluster kit with zero chase potential when it comes to killer interaction. So overall, I always think that 007 will just be the worst unless he gets some small tiny adjustments, like just making his clone AI a little more intelligent for the ones that aren't cursor would boost him off the pedestal for me so much more, and it's just tiny little changes that he needs to make him better. So how would I fix him? Well, I think I personally would just give him slightly longer undetectable and invisibility time to allow for more repositioning time during cloning, and just improve the clone AI to make them seem more realistic and player-like, just like Noli's updated clone AI. I get not every character is meant to have chase potential, and that's okay. I just personally believe that 007 gets outclassed by other survivors in the game. And also, people like to think that he's better than Noob, but in my honest opinion, that's not even remotely close to being true. Noob can be a true monster during chase and last man standing. He has stealth, a defense ability, and speed boost power that can make him a true nightmare, but I won't get into him today, and if you like to see me talk about Noob, then please let me know. Anyways, I've talked long enough, and I'd like to hear your own opinions, as this video is just one big opinion from one person on the internet, and if you have any changes you'd make to 007 to make him better, or if you enjoy playing him, then leave some comments. I encourage you to discuss amongst yourselves, and I'll check some of them out, but please keep it civil and respectful. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and liked what you saw, and if you did, then please subscribe and leave some suggestions for future videos that you'd like to see me make as well. I do make videos on PvZ in addition to my Forsaken videos as well, and I plan on covering outcome memories upon its next big update, and maybe Alter Ego if people like it. I haven't really seen much, but if you enjoy any of those games, then maybe my channel's for you. Join the Discord if you'd like, the link's in the description, and it's a good way to connect with other cool and groovy people in my community as well as myself. Other than that, I hope you have a great day, week, month, whichever comes first, and I'll see you next time. Peace out!